Welcome to Real Life Renos, the podcast. This is part 2 of our conversation with Robert Lipka, who is currently a principal urban designer with the City of Edmonton. Also joining in the conversation is Ron Wickman, an architect who specializes in barrier-free design. Our conversation focused on small towns and the challenges of becoming accessible when century buildings weren't built with accessibility, much less universal design, in mind. Speaking of universal design, later on in the podcast we chatted about words and how much they matter. Welcome back, and it's good to have Ron Wickman with us again, and of course Robert Lipka has joined us as promised in the last podcast. We're going to take a look in this podcast at urban development and the plight that many small towns are finding themselves in, where they have these centuries old buildings that really aren't accessible. They've got narrow sidewalks. There's no place to park, certainly not for an accessible vehicle. How do we solve all of this, Robert? We're looking to people like you to solve these problems for us.
Well, well, I can go on for hours for that one, Karen, but I'll try to make it short and sweet. But I think, from a rural perspective, as we were talking about a while back, um, you know, even though I grew up in downtown Toronto, I grew up in a village. Like the area is called Bloordale. For those who know Toronto, it's just north of Parkdale, which is more famous for some good and bad reasons in Toronto from a crime perspective. But anyway, yeah, the community where I grew up in, all of my schools that I went from, zero to finishing high school, were within 5-minute walk from my house. All the shopping, all the food stores, all the clothing stores, everything you wanted was in 5-minute walk. So, we beat the whole 15-minute city thing. We had a 5-minute city where I grew up in. So that's used to be the beauty of small towns, right? If you drive throughout, especially in Ontario where you are, because I'm from Ontario, so I know, but also even in smaller towns in Alberta as well, which I've been to a number of them so far. Haven't seen them all yet, but they do have a center, right? They have a heart. They have, usually there's the community center, there's the Legion, there are other, kind of draws to get into the village. But unfortunately, over time, developers have come in, looked at, redeveloping farmland further out from the village center to build, big box retail, right? So you're getting your Walmarts, your superstores, your et cetera, et cetera. And so unfortunately, over time, a lot of the smaller shops that used to be in these village centers are slowly died, and there's not much to replace them, unfortunately. And so you're having people who are basically living in their car, driving everywhere to get anything if they live in a rural community. Um, and so that just makes it more difficult. You raised a good point about a lot of the older buildings in these older villages and smaller, hamlets and towns weren't accessible. But to me, the answer is not, building massive Walmarts further out so that people have to drive to them, because sometimes those aren't, even though they're just a big flat shop. Sometimes the parking lots aren't very well designed from an accessibility perspective. I'm sure Ron can tell you stories about that. And so the concept of trying to make the existing hamlet or the village center more accessible is possible. It's obviously going to take some time, but redeveloping some of these older buildings, you could put ramps on them at the front or at the side of the building, or even at the rear, because a lot of them have rear alley access. So if you improve the alleyways, the rear alleys, then you could make them more accessible. You have people repurposing some of these old kind of older, smaller kind of factory buildings that are all one level, so that's perfect. You could do something amazing with those buildings as well in some of the smaller communities. So there's a lot of opportunities out there to definitely make these smaller towns more accessible.
Ron, what say you?
Well, interestingly enough, I was thinking back to when I started my own practice. So that was 1995, and at the time, I honestly didn't know or think that other architects didn't know what I knew about accessibility. So I just assumed that um, every architect knew a lot about accessibility, and maybe my edge was that I knew it a little bit better. But I've since discovered that that's not completely true. Um, and I thought, as a kind of marketing strategy for myself, I would target small towns. So instead of competing with the big firms in Edmonton and for work, I would go into small towns, thinking about the fact that the population is aging, and thinking, well, they're going to have to make their little city hall more accessible, the shops, everything, restaurants, coffee shops, everything more accessible. I thought this would be a good opportunity for me to get some work that maybe a lot of the other architects wouldn't really be looking for. Interestingly enough, I ended up learning a lot about marketing myself, and just getting comfortable with talking about what I can provide, services, so on. Learning a little bit more about the business of being an architect, but I don't remember ever getting any work. So, so luckily, I picked up some work here and there. I did some house renovations, and it didn't take long before word got out that I did have this unique take on design, from an accessibility point of view, and then it just kind of slowly grew from there. What's interesting is today I'm getting asked more and more now to uh, buy small towns to kind of have a look at things, and just in a really interesting twist of fate, my my son and his wife and family, they started a small craft brewery in Devon, which is about a 30-minute drive from Edmonton, just between Ed- Edmonton and the international airport. It's a small community of about 6,000 people, and they wanted to create something that had a bit of a community feel, something that people would feel comfortable coming and joining in on, just good gatherings. So although it is a place where you drink alcohol, craft beer is way too expensive to have too many before you break your budget. So it's just a good place for people to socialize. My kids have worked really hard to have like events like trivia night, and they have artists and singers coming. And it's just become a bit of a hub, and it's been really interesting watching that from my point of view, seeing how a small business can really get people to gather and bring people together. And certainly one thing from my point of view in helping them out was to make sure the space was super accessible. So they're very accommodating to people with different disabilities, certainly accessible bathrooms and so on. And we've got some visual aids, we've got a hearing loop at the front counter for people who use hearing aids and so on. So um, I'm kind of now sort of slowly investing some of my own time and spirit into what could Devon look like. It's a place where people can bike to from Edmonton within 20 minutes or so, or half an hour maybe. So it's almost as quick to get to Devon by bicycle as it is by car.
So just
And
to get back to the
yeah,
building for
yeah.
a second, Ron, was it an existing building or a purpose
Yeah,
built?
yeah. So it's just off the center street, where there's a bunch of your older buildings, and it
Right.
is a strip. It is a space within a strip mall. So it already has kind of the on grade access.
So
But
you
they
didn't
had
have
to
to
do
do much in terms of entrance,
we,
and so it
no,
was it
no,
was
we didn't.
inside.
That's right. Yeah, and then they were looking at one point on the main street, but they're so close to the main street, and as it turns out, they've got this big parking lot just outside their space. So in the summer they were able to. They've been open less than a year. So in the summer when they opened, they were able to take over a bunch of parking stalls and have an outdoor patio area. And what's also interesting is that the Devon Council, uh, the decision makers in Devon, were very much in favor of this. So they've done everything to support this small business to invest in their community. So there's probably more interest from small cities to get some of this stuff done, because they do want to create a nice little place for residents, and they do recognize that the residents of rural Alberta are generally aging, right? So more so than even in cities. So so I agree totally with Robert that we should somehow fight the big box stores from infiltrating these small towns and create a town that is more conducive to pedestrians and people on bikes and so on. Um, but
Yeah.
economics, that it's the double-edged sword.
It's a tough one. It's a tough one. I was asked, I was just thinking about it when you were talking, Ron. I was asked to go to speak to a group in Lacombe. The city planners and the mayor actually is really keen. And that's what's a great thing about the smaller towns is they can actually make change happen quicker, right? As you
Hmm.
alluded to. I provided a presentation on accessibility, and they showed me some of the shops that are really keen along their main street to be more accessible, and I showed them some imagery of ramps that they could put in, making sure that obviously they can actually safely access the shop, but also that a lot of ramps that when stores put them in, they can be quite dangerous for somebody with low vision because they're hard to see sometimes, right? So making sure they have proper barriers around them and maybe they're a brighter color so they stand out a bit more. This would be a lot harder to deliver in a large city like we're in Edmonton, where I am, but in a smaller town, you could start rolling some of these things out, right? You could put in
Hmm.
ramps in particular places, and I suggested to them as a more longer term goal is to actually look at widening, maybe not necessarily widening their entire sidewalk because that's costly, but what they could do is actually take one of the parking lanes or the driving lanes out. They have two, they could make it a one-way street, their main street, and actually push out the parking to the next lane out, and then that old parking lane could be a lane where basically pedestrians could use. So you just have ramps on either end of it, and people on mobility chairs will, you know, wheelchairs, etc., could actually access that space because it's nice and flat, and it's pretty smooth and very accessible. So that's something they can consider further on down the line. And small towns can do that because they can do it a heck of a lot quicker. You'll
Hmm.
see that if you go to some other small towns in Alberta, they're implementing tactile walking surface indicators, the Twizzies, the little yellow dots at intersections. They're putting them in on their main streets. It's incredible.
Hmm.
Whereas we're still struggling to do that in Edmonton. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
in
it's true.
Edmonton, you have a design guideline, and that is something that a lot of big cities have. Some smaller counties and so forth do as well. But as you have previously noted, it really only applies to the municipally owned buildings, owned and operated essentially, or the ones that are leased out. In terms of the older buildings that are owned by the people who run stores in them, you're indicating that there is some interest in accessibility. What about the towns that have a large percentage of buildings owned as an investment by somebody in a big city far, far away? How can they be incentivized? Is there anything that is being done with the guidelines that Edmonton has, as a for instance, that could be duplicated elsewhere? But then, how do you incentivize these owners who aren't there very much? Maybe they go once a year or something, but they do
Yeah.
everything else remotely, and they just are interested in renting it out and having the investment. How do you incentivize them to help their tenants become more accessible?
Yeah, that's definitely more difficult. I guess there's two separate questions there. The first one with respect to some sort of guideline or standard document. Actually, Ron mentioned that both of myself and him sit on the Safety Codes Council of Alberta, which has the barrier-free design guide. So the barrier-free design guide applies all across the province. So any of these small towns could use that document for their benefit, right? So it's like similar to what we have. The City of Edmonton created the Access Design Guide separately. I tried to bring the two together, but the city was really adamant about creating its own document because there are some things in the barrier-free design guide that aren't covered for the city of Edmonton, i.e., LRT, right? So not every city has light rapid transit, or even a bus system, and so those are the things that, amongst other things, that are covered in our access design guide. But quite frankly, the barrier free design guide for the province of Alberta from the Safety Codes Council is very thorough, and it could be very helpful to smaller municipalities. So they could use that to push it in front of developers and say, hey, here's some ways that we could redesign the front, access of your building to make it more accessible. Now, the second part of it is trying to encourage people. That's the tougher one, especially they're not, like as you said, Karen, if they don't live in the town where they own the property. That's definitely going to be more difficult. But having worked with a lot of business owners in a previous life, when I used to be a consultant before I started working for government, um, quite frankly, like, I don't understand why a business owner would want to not encourage between 25 to 27% of the population in Alberta has some form of disability that is hindered by the built environment. So basically, you're cutting out 25% or more of your future customers, right? So to me, that's not good business. So, that's the way I would try to sell it to them and help them by showing these guidelines that would make it a little bit easier for them to design. Because as Ron pointed out, there's a lot of architects out there that really need some training. And I know Ron's been doing a heck of a job
Yeah.
trying to upskill people. But yeah, it's amazing how many architects that I deal with on a daily basis when we're, talking about the developments that they're working on. And some of them do have some knowledge of accessibility, which is great. Point them to our access design guide. Like, I know they don't have to follow it, but here, have a look. But yeah, there are a lot of architects out there that don't have a clue. Yes.
Ron, anything in defense of the architects? No, I mean,
Well,
Not all. Not
in
all.
yeah,
fairness, in a previous podcast, you said that when you were being educated, the only way that the topic was brought up was when you brought it up, and that's
hmm,
because you had a
yeah,
family reference. So,
yeah, yeah.
again, it goes back to schooling, which we've mentioned so many times. The professionals, the trades, they're not taught this stuff in school.
Yeah, well, exactly, and it's not just the design world, but we talked a bit about people in the general public, builders, developers. It's a topic that's been around for a long time, but it's still not well understood. So it seems that people really will engage the issue of accessibility when it really hits them personally, right? So either themselves or a family member or so on. And so it's a tough struggle to make some of these positive changes for accessibility when people don't understand what the benefits are, right? So we've tried to promote it as something that it's just, morally it's the right thing to do. And that might affect some people, but uh, it's we've tried to say there's economic benefits to it, but until somebody does it and makes it work financially in a real positive way, they're kind of waiting for somebody to invest time and money into that to see how they do. Um, we've tried to make the case that we can make it beautiful and that it benefits everybody. Certainly, I think the thing that's really gained traction is the fact that we can argue that a curb cut is a good example of something that was originally designed for a very specific population of people that now we see the benefits of it, right? So that this thing we call the curb cut effect, where we design something that is specific to a population of people, but then we realize it benefits everybody in a really positive way. So there's all of that. But, again, I guess for me, at this point in my life, what I really feel needs to happen is that we need to develop a critical mass of understanding, a critical mass of people that truly understand the issues enough to move the needle forward, so to speak, right? So uh, I think in many ways, Robert and I kind of feel like we're in small boats all by ourselves, in amongst all these people that they're all working on important things, but they just, I don't know, for some reason they just kind of leave us alone and don't, don't always want to listen to us. And
Well, yeah,
so yeah, I don't know how to, I think inevitably time will just allow us to have that happen, but um, I'm turning 60 this year, so I keep saying like I'm on the wrong side of time now. So
well,
I want to see some real positive change, and I certainly have in my lifetime. But it seems agonizing sometimes how slow it can be, right?
yeah, I'm with Rod. I just turned 55 not too long ago, so I get it. But but I didn't want to just pick on architects. I try to pick on everybody. Like in my role at the city, I have a lot of issues. Ron mentioned curb cuts, right? I deal a lot with engineers, and in my previous job in Auckland, I used to be the only urban designer in a transport agency, and so now I'm kind of using those skills that I learned, engineering skills that I learned. I'm not an engineer, but I've worked with engineers for well over 10 years, so picked up a few things along the way. And curb cut design is a perfect example, like Ron pointed out. Obviously, it was specifically designed for people in wheelchairs. But when you come to Edmonton, when I first arrived here, a lot of the curb cuts you'll see have these little grooves in them. And so I asked the engineer, I go, these grooves are just to get the water off the sidewalk, correct? And he's like, oh no, well, they help get water off the sidewalk, but they're also good for guiding people with visual impairments. And I said, really? Okay. So somebody who has a cane, walking cane using to guide themselves if they have low vision, or somebody with a guide dog, etc. When those little grooves in the sidewalk get filled in because we have winter, we have sand and salt and other stuff going down on the road, eventually those little grooves get filled up. So how is somebody supposed to detect those little grooves? Oh well, we clean them out, we brush them out. Okay, that's good. Um, and then the next question I asked them, I said, well, why are all these grooves pointing to the center of the intersection? Because most of the curb cuts are at the top of the curve, and they point you to the middle of the intersection. So obviously that's not safe to cross that way. So I asked the gentleman. I said, well, why are they pointing that way then? Are you trying to get rid of your certain population, or what's going on here? This is interesting. And he didn't really understand I had to describe it and show him what I meant. And he kind of turned and looked at me and said, oh, yeah, that's not good. So yeah, we're not doing those anymore. And we are putting in the grooves, but now we're starting to put in all the newer sidewalks. We're actually putting in tactile walking surface indicators, those
Mhm.
little yellow domes, so that people can actually, sense where the hazard is, which is before they get to the curb cut. No, there's a danger. Stop and wait for the traffic light to go, or for vehicles to stop if they're at a zebra crossing, and then they can proceed. So yeah, that's just one example of frustrations that I have with engineers as well. So it's not just architects.
No, but that is a perfect segue to a topic that I do want to discuss because, Robert, when you and I were talking earlier, you brought up an expression that really caught my ear, the accessible journey. Can you
Yes,
talk a bit about that and explain what that is?
I'd love to.
Yeah.
When I first moved to New Zealand back in 2006, in my work at Auckland Transport, I was lucky enough to meet this lovely lady, Vivian Naylor. She's been in a wheelchair for most of her life. She's an ardent supporter of trying to push designers like myself, because I was pretty young and naive at the time when I first met her, and didn't understand a lot of these things. And she took me around the city, and we were talking about how it was difficult for her to get around. And she mentioned this whole concept of the accessible journey that had started in New Zealand back in 2005, through their one of their human rights commissions they had in the central government, was to look at trying to create the accessible journey for everybody. And they have this really interesting images to describe that. And basically, what it's saying is that I can go from my house to visit my friend down the street. I can go, to the shop down the road. I can get on a bus. I can take the bus to go to my friend's house, or I can go to work. I can come back. I can go to the community center and then take another bus or take a LRT or whatever, however you or walk around, and you can get to your house. All of those trips you can do under your own power, right? Because in Edmonton, like many cities in Canada, we have a program called DATS. So basically it's a little mini buses that people, if they're in a wheelchair, mobility scooter, they can call up. Usually you have to book it 2 or 3 days in advance. So if you have a doctor's appointment or you want to go shopping, you book it, and then the bus comes and picks you up from the front of your house and takes you where you got to go. And then obviously, you go do your shopping or whatever, and then you have to call for another one that picks you up and takes you home. So there will always be people, that will need this kind of service. But my argument is that if Edmonton was more friendly from a built environment perspective, more accessible, that a lot of people who currently use the DATS system wouldn't have to. They'd be able to get on a regular bus just like everybody else does, get on the LRT, go down to their corner store, the sidewalk, cross the street without having to worry about not having a curb cut on either side, making sure there's proper signalized, crossings and all that stuff, making sure that it's safe and accessible, and they could do all their stuff without having to rely on anybody else. So that's, in the nutshell, that's the accessible journey.
Just picking up on something you said, Robert, I was thinking about a young man I know who I've known for quite a long time now. He was just a young boy when I first met him, and he uses a power wheelchair to get around, and we were just having a Zoom conversation, just like you and I are having. He was showing me an app that he uses to go on journeys in and around Edmonton. So he lives probably in his wheelchair a good half an hour at least to get from his house to the downtown of Edmonton, and he was showing me how uh, he can figure out the right pathway that is all hard surface for him to be able to get to the downtown. And I just said, well, hopefully you go with somebody. 'Cause I hate the idea of you like running out of juice in your power chair. And he goes, well, I know approximately how long it can run, and he goes, no, it's all good. I sometimes go by myself, and I'm like, wow, there's a lot of potential danger in that. But he's a confident young man who has no problems with it, and I was frankly quite amazed at the fact that the technology actually exists, right? And and I was also going to say that I've had a relationship with the University of Alberta for quite a long time now, over 20 years, almost 30 years now, and working with students in industrial design and occupational therapy and human ecology, all of those areas, and just learning about how students try to make the world better for people with disabilities, and the student mind is fantastic for thinking outside the box and being innovative. They're not they haven't been crushed yet by reality and all that sort of stuff. But I know that there's been a lot of work lately at using technology to help people with disabilities navigate especially the university campus and get around there. And the one thing that you and I were just talking about is the app itself. The technology is only as good as the people that create it. So it's the information that we feed it that will get into making it better for us to be able to get around. So this issue of public washrooms, I remember probably, I think it was the year 2000. I was at a conference in Montreal, so that 24 years ago, and there was a hour and a half presentation from a young lady, an industrial designer from England. It was all about public bathrooms, and so how hard it is for seniors to live in the city and get around because they have to know where all the public bathrooms are. And when they're downtown, you can't just go and use a bathroom in a coffee shop or a washroom or sorry, a restaurant without being like a patron, right? So basically, the gist of her presentation was that a lot of people who are older are being kind of held hostage in their homes because they're too afraid to venture out into public, uh, because of the fear that they just won't be able to find a washroom that they can use. And that was really something, right? That I, well, 24 years ago, I was 24 years younger, so I didn't think, I think about those things today, but I didn't then. But
Well,
it's
I'm with
it's
you.
like a
I'm
real
with you,
reality.
Ron. Oh, I'm with you because public washrooms are a huge passion of mine, and also because not because I'm just getting older and I need to use them more frequently, but also the fact that having lived in a country where, like in New Zealand, public washrooms are everywhere. Like it's incredible, and they're
Yeah,
so well designed. And when I came back to Canada, we were walking around when I first moved to Edmonton, walking around downtown. It was hard to find a public washroom. Like you said, you
yeah.
had to go into a shop and buy something and use the facilities. And like you mentioned, the apps are great to have, but it's making sure that the information has been created by somebody who has that overarching experience, that understands not only people who are in wheelchairs, mobility scooters, but also people with low vision, people with dementia, people who are maybe are have hard of hearing, et cetera, et cetera. Because some washrooms might be listed in a particular app saying, oh yeah, this one's really good for somebody in a wheelchair, but somebody with visual impairment might have difficulties using it for a variety of reasons, and I could go through another time. But yeah, so it's just making sure that the information has been put together by somebody who has that holistic kind of view, and it might be obviously multiple people involved in developing something like that. The city is trying to improve. The city of Edmonton has recreated the website, and we have our public washrooms listed now, and they have a bit more detail in them. If any of your listeners want to see the ultimate, go to Australia Public Toilets. I think it's .com. I can send Karen the link,
Yeah,
and it
do
has every single public washroom in the country of Australia, and it tells you details of each public washroom, what's in it, what it doesn't have. It'll tell you if it's not accessible. It'll say it's not accessible to such and such people who have kind of mobility challenges they may have. It's incredible. So New Zealand is not up at that level yet, but they do have a pretty good system. And so when we were traveling around with our daughter at the time when she was very young, it was great because we could find public washrooms everywhere. Big city like Auckland, Wellington, or the smallest town, no problem.
That's fantastic. Yeah, if you
Yeah,
would send me that link, then I will put it in our show notes. That'd be just great. Ron, you don't
perfect.
happen to remember the name of the app, do you?
The app that Daniel used, no, I don't. No,
There,
it
I was
it
wondering if
was a,
it
it
was.
was a City of Edmonton app.
Oh, okay.
So it's like
There,
you go to the City of Edmonton website, and then they, I don't know, it's like trails or something. So they basically grade the trail. So uh, if it's like a dirt trail, they'll let you know. If it's hard surface like asphalt or concrete, they'll let you know.
okay.
And so
Yeah,
that's kind of how he does. I'm sure it's still, I'm sure he still finds himself in places where this is just too hard to navigate for him. Um, it just because there's so many different wheelchairs out there, right? And
yeah.
and so yeah.
There is
Well, I
an
know they've
app.
been prioritizing certain routes, so yeah, this Ron's right. It's on the City of Edmonton website. I'm not completely familiar with it because I don't have a cell phone because I'm strange. But for those who do have cell phones, it's pretty easy to find. It's on the city website, and yeah, you can download the app, and it has the larger trails, right, in there, the more frequently used ones. And I know the city is trying to eventually update all of them, but that's going to take time. And some of the trails will never be accessible, and that's fine. It's just because of grade change, etc. It'd be too expensive to make them fully accessible.
Mhm.
But we're starting to get more and more. Starting with the funicular, right? The funicular was a project that was finished a few years ago, and now somebody can actually wheelchair from downtown, go down the funicular and get really close to the water, which you couldn't before, in the river. So that's really nice. So in
Mhm.
time, we'll get better at doing that. Yeah.
If you did have a cell phone, you would be able to download an app called Access Now, which I will put a link to on our show notes. And actually, the person who created this app is somebody that I hope to do a podcast with at some point. She has muscular dystrophy, and she created this app that people can add to. And I know that Julie Sawchuk, who is somebody that we're all familiar with, did a map mission day, which was spearheaded by this app, Access Now, just the other day. And she was map missioning her town where she lives, and they did a blitz and went all around to the stores, and it was about how accessible the stores are and whether or not they have accessible washrooms and what the components are of their accessibility. It's really quite something. But you're right, Ron, when you say that it really is dependent on the quality of the information that people upload, and whoever creates any app has to be kind of content to have whatever information they have and to have that information be corrected if necessary at some point.
Yeah, I made the point because I know when I was working in New Zealand, there was somebody working on that, but the person was in a wheelchair, so their main focus was obviously that, right? So that's
Mhm.
great, but yeah, we have to get others involved as well to make sure that we're not, yeah, excluding anybody.
Right.
And just to comment on kind of the flip side of all of this too is, I keep thinking, I thought maybe I was the oldest person to not be embracing technology, but maybe maybe Robert's slightly younger than me. But
It'd be me.
um, so we're kind of dinosaurs in a way, but in a good way. But on the flip side, I I think that until we perfect the apps, which I don't think will ever really truly be done, um, or we gain this critical mass of people who understand the complex issues often that relate to creating a more accessible built environment. We still rely on key people, um, champions, if you may, who can really individually make change happen, right? And so, I witnessed that growing up with my father becoming a city of Edmonton politician. He was an activist and advocate for people with disabilities ever since I was born. And so the city of Edmonton has really benefited from one person, one individual who kind of spearheaded the charge. Of course, there were others involved, but we really relied on somebody that took activism to another level, got involved in the political system, made change happen. He was also a provincial MLA for 12 years. So, I've seen how one person can make a real big difference. And kind of taking it back to our conversations about small towns, it doesn't get any easier or better for an opportunity to do something like that. The main street of Devon, for example, is what, 3 or 4 blocks. It wouldn't take much for the mayor of Devon to say, you know what, we're gonna use this as an example to maybe get the province involved, the federal government even, to create a great 4 blocks of pedestrian friendly, accessible design with proper curb cuts and crosswalks and all the rest. Because it is a smaller scale thing. It's actually achievable without a lot of layers of bureaucracy and so on to get done. Um, in a slightly larger way, I've seen it. I've witnessed it in the city of Lethbridge, which it's got to be more than 100,000 people now. But the last time that I was working there, it was around 100,000 people, and it, the city had a couple of champions actually. One who's since retired, I worked with. He worked for the city of Lethbridge in the building department. He himself had a disability. He was hard of hearing, and but he was all over accessibility. And so whenever he got involved in a project uh, that they had to do for their city owned buildings, he always made sure they had a high degree of accessibility. And I was hired to do an audit of all the city-owned buildings, and got to become quite familiar with Lethbridge. And the other champion is a gentleman who uses a power wheelchair, and he's just I always would say this about my dad, and I would say this about Chris, is a little bit of a woodpecker on the decision makers' brains, right? You just keep you keep bugging them until they finally, do what you want, because you might go away. But they do have a particular street in Lethbridge that's about 6 blocks long, and the intersections are just so well done with the tactile truncated domes in the curb cuts. The streets, the crossings have they're lit up when you press the button, and just a really wonderful example within a smaller city of what can be done when when people push for it, right? And I couldn't help but think that it could happen in a city the size of Lethbridge, and it would just be so much harder to make it happen in Edmonton or Calgary. Like, even picking the intersection that would best happen. Maybe, Robert, you can talk a little bit about 104th Street in the downtown of Edmonton. That, I think there was some push there to create a more accessible couple of blocks there.
Yeah, 104 is a good example of what I would say probably not the best solution in the end. To describe it to people, basically, it used to be like a regular street with curb and channel. And then before I arrived, I can't remember exactly when it was done, probably, I don't know, 2010, 2012, whatever it was. And they redesigned the entire street, and they basically did rolled curbs. So the curbs kind of, they're a little bit flat, but they're still a curb, right? A curb edge. And so that's easier for somebody in a wheelchair mobility scooter to get across, but it creates a lot of issues for somebody with low vision because they find it difficult to locate this rolled curb, because usually they're looking for a hard curb, right? So you usually get the right angle curb. It's easy to identify when you're tapping with your cane. When you get a rolled curb, it's a little bit harder to distinguish where the sidewalk is and where the street is, where the cars are. And so it's harder for them to figure out where they are. So I would much prefer either you do redo the street so it's just like a normal street with sidewalks and curbs, hard edge curbs, so they're easy to identify, or you do a shared space, which is basically from building line to building line, it's all flat. And then what we have an example of this in Edmonton now. It's just been recently constructed. It's right near City Hall on 10. I'm trying to remember is it 103? I always forget the numbers. But anyway, it actually has we call them tactile delineator strips. So what it is, it's a different type of material, and it's actually detectable underfoot, so you can feel it. It's 600 millimeters wide minimum, so that people don't step over and miss it. And so they could walk along the street. So there's cars and there's people, but the tactile delinear strip is designed so it's closer to the building. So people with low vision, they feel more comfortable because they hear the sound bouncing off from the building. They feel more comfortable being there instead of being close to traffic, and so they can navigate the streets safely. So these are the type of things you can do to make streets really interesting and nice places to be. Shared spaces allow for shops to open up right onto the street. You could close off the street on the weekend and have a market because it's all one level. It's easy. So there's lots of really interesting things you can do with those. With those types of streets, but you have to obviously think of how you're going to make sure you're designing it, particularly people with low vision. How would they navigate that street? Which is, it can be done. It has been done in many places. We just need to do a better job of it. Um, yeah, the rolled curb example. Again, this is what I was talking about, how somebody came along and said, okay, from a wheelchair perspective, this is great, but it's not necessarily great for other disabilities, right? So we got to make sure we think about others as well.
Very complex issues.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why you need that expertise too, right? And
Right.
I kind of been saying this is that there's not too many people out there with the expertise to look at the issues, and sometimes I'm sure, Robert, you feel like this too, like you're talking to people, other planners, decision, your council, and you're saying a bunch of stuff and they're kind of nodding their head going, oh yeah, okay. But do they really understand what you're saying? Right. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's we find ourselves, I think, in a bit of a teaching position where we're
Yeah.
just trying to educate people about things that we're very, very familiar with. Right. And
Yeah.
so we have to answer a lot of questions, for like engineers and again, like I said, politicians, to be able to get things done, right? And
Mm.
sometimes we're not included in those discussions,
Yeah.
and then that's why you get a street that's conducive to people who use wheelchairs, but not so much for other disability, for example.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's just, I think it's kind of going back to what you were talking about, Ron, is the fact that, ever since I've like worked in another country and how they look at accessible issues, I think one of the things that still kind of I guess, kind of hits me in Canada is we've decided to go for the accessible term, right? Accessibility is now the term. If you look at the new Accessible Canada Act that was created a couple of years ago, right? Everything's to do with accessibility. And I still think sometimes that that term kind of pigeonholes people, and people who don't have any mobility challenges, they think, oh, it's all just for those people. It's not for me. Whereas in other countries, like as you know, Ron, like in Europe and Norway, they use universal design, right? It's this. It's I think it's a better way to sell it to the general population, because all of these elements that we've been talking about, this podcast and the previous one, are about elements that benefit everybody, not just people with disabilities, right? And that term universal design, I think, speaks to that more eloquently, as opposed to accessibility, which unfortunately, I think a lot of people think that it's just for those people who have, sight loss, or who are in a wheelchair or a mobility scooter, etc. So yeah, I think that's one of the things we need to, another thing to add to the pile, to fight for, right? Is to show that, as I said, that's why I think the stats are really important. That's, I quoted those stats earlier. StatsCan recently sent out their numbers for people with any kind of disability that's impacted by the built environment. And if you look, Alberta is 26% of the population. All across Canada, it's about 24 to 25%. PEI in other provinces are even higher. Some are up to 30% of the population. So we're seeing all across the country. And these are statistics from 2022. So if you look back to 2018 StatsCan statistics, Canada was probably about 20% that identified it with some disability that's impacted by the built environment. Now we're up to 25, 26%. It's only going to get higher. So, pretty soon we'll be up to 30% of the population. So
Mhm.
it could make our jobs a bit easier, right, to argue for these things, because now there's more people. But still, it's just shocking to me that we have to have these discussions still with professionals who work in the built environment and see this on a regular basis. I get questioned about engineers at work saying, why do we need curb cuts everywhere? I don't see people in wheelchairs crossing at this intersection. Like, are you standing there 7 days a week, 24 hours a day? Like, come on. So it's just, well, we still have to argue for those things sometimes. It's shocking.
You're very right about the words, though, and using inclusive design instead of accessibility. Words matter so much. I find when I talk to clients about Ron and I have talked about this before. I talk to them about showers, and we talk about a barrier-free shower, a roll-in shower, an accessible shower. As soon as I call it a Euro shower,
Mhm.
that's it. They want one because
Yeah,
that's the sexy term, Euro
exactly.
shower, which doesn't imply that they are somehow different.
Yes, exactly. Was it lovely lady I met in Australia when I was there a long time ago? I was at a conference, and she works for the Victoria government, the state government, and she described how she would develop presentations for developers to encourage them to develop more accessible housing out in suburbia. And so she described it really eloquently, and I can send you. I think I have a copy of her presentation, but it's just the way she showed that you can design the homes right from the outset. So a young couple buys this house, and a lot of the stuff is hidden. right? It's behind the walls of the bathroom. There's extra studs put in so that you could add a grab bar later, right? In the shower, like Ron will know all about this stuff. But it's just having these homes built so that they're easy to adapt when somebody needs them, right? Or if they have, an older relative has to move in with them, they can easily adapt this house without having to move, and for very cost-effective way to make the house fully accessible. It's incredible, and I can't believe they've been doing this in Australia for over 10 years now. And a lot of their new home construction, yeah, we have to pick up on some of these things as well in Canada.
Mhm.
Even the concept of the visitable home, which we were
Hmm.
talking about earlier, makes so much sense because if it is a two-story house, for instance, and the occupants find that they need to live on one level all of a sudden, it's already done.
Hmm.
They have to find a room to transform into a bedroom, but essentially that's all they have to do because the washroom is already there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Terrific. Well, I will ask for final words from each of you. And as we bring this fascinating podcast to a close, Robert, you're the guest. Would you like to go first?
Well, I just wanted to thank you so much, Karen and Ron, for this opportunity, to talk about these things. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about it, and I can talk for hours. So if you want to do more podcasts, I'm up for it. But
Don't
hint,
say
hint.
that because we're gonna rope you in.
That's okay. But no, I really enjoyed it, and yeah, I just any way I can get the word out, the more. I've been trying to do this since I came back to Canada, is really trying to get people to really think of these things. And it's for me, it's just pre-planning for me because I know one day I'm going to need all these elements as well. I'm being selfish. I want to get all these things into our streets, into our neighborhoods, into our homes, so that yeah, as we age, as we change over time, that our we can live that accessible journey, and that's my goal for the country. Hopefully someday we'll get there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I've enjoyed learning from you and hope to learn more in the future. And Ron, any final words from you?
Um, yeah, I kind of at a higher level, I guess, but um, I can already think of future podcasts for the three of us, and that would be to look overseas at what's happening in places like Australia, New Zealand, and Europe as well. And it's certainly something that I've been coming to grips with. That does kind of play off of what Robert talked about with the language. Um, for far too long, I think Canada's been influenced by what happens in the States. And I think we need to pay more attention to what's happening elsewhere in the world. And I'm part of an international group of architects focusing in on issues around social issues, I guess you could say, which does involve people with disabilities. Um, and I certainly get a much different take from people in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, even South America, the group that I'm a part of. And they do talk about this idea of being inclusive in a very holistic way. So they do talk about inclusion for people of color, people with different, ethnic backgrounds, people with disabilities. Um, I feel like sometimes here in North America, we get pigeonholed into, even when we say the term universal design, the default ends up being people with disabilities. And so I think we have to let the states do what they do, and be more inspired by what's happening elsewhere, and learn from experts in different parts of the world that I think have a much better understanding of what universal design or inclusive design is really all about. And I do agree with Robert that this term accessibility does very much talk about people with disabilities. And I've kind of, within my own profession of architects, I've decided to focus on that issue. So even in the architectural world where we talk about being inclusive, the discussions usually revolve around our First Nations populations, people of color. and they forget the fact that inclusion means people with disabilities too in our our aging population. So I just feel like I'm that person that has to keep reminding people that inclusion is a bigger thing than just um, uh, people of color, First Nations, even our gay community. So all very important. And if we think about all of the issues all at the same time, I think we'll make much better progress.
A very positive comment to end our podcast on. So again, my thanks to both of you, and I will thank those who have been listening to us. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing all of you again on the next episode of Real Life Renos, the podcast.